Daytona Beach criminal defense attorney Linda Hadad had her career irrevocably derailed as a result of illegal drug use and for being intimate with her jailed clients. Hadad had been practicing law in Florida since 2002. Records indicated that from 2010 to 2015 she'd been arrested at least 5 times on charges such as driving while intoxicated, theft, and fleeing police. In March of 2016, the 43-year-old was disbarred after her pattern of misconduct came to light. The Florida bar stated that Hadad had failed to appear for court hearings multiple times over and that she had closed her office without informing her clients, some of whom had criminal cases that she had neglected. It was also found out that she'd made obscene phone calls to clients who were in jail. During her deposition, a couple of the phone call recordings were played. In one of the recordings, Hadad could be heard saying to her client, "I can't wait to touch your..." She added that she'd have to get her adult toy as well. The woman not only admitted it was her in the recordings, but also confessed to renting a car for a client in exchange for drugs. She also admitted to using cocaine, crack, ecstasy, pot, meth, LSD, as well as prescription drugs such as Xanax, Adderall, Oxycodone, and Lortab without prescriptions. Number 9. Jonathan Lowe. On May the 16th of 2016, a reporter from KPHO TV was arrested after he defecated on the front lawn of a home in Goodyear, Arizona, where he was covering a story. A woman in the neighborhood saw 33-year-old Jonathan Lowe leaning up against the house while taking a dump. The woman called law enforcement and reported the man. When a responding officer arrived, Lowe admitted to relieving himself in the front yard. He explained that he'd been feeling very sick and had been stuck in the van all day. He also claimed that he had to stay in the area, so heading to a nearby public toilet to unburden his bowels was not an option. Lowe was taken into custody and charged with public defecation. He was facing a fine of $2,500 or 6 months behind bars. In the end, Lowe was released on his own recognizance, but was fired from the station. Talk about dumping on your own career. Number 8. Diane Ferrera. 25-year-old officer Diane Ferrera from the St. Cloud Police Department was fired after she stole and used a dead man's credit card information. Ferrera responded to a 911 medical call on April the 3rd of 2023. The victim had suffered sudden cardiac arrest and died. While in the home, Ferrera snapped pictures of the deceased man's credit card and then proceeded to use it to make purchases. The man's widow eventually noticed suspicious activities on the billing statements. The statements indicated 7 mobile food orders, a hotel stay, and a meal at Wendy's, all of which amounted to $500. The widow contacted the police regarding the matter. Investigators obtained a description of the suspect's car at one of the businesses and later determined that the tags matched a vehicle under Ferrera's name. According to the Osceola County Sheriff, Ferrera admitted to taking photos of the credit card and storing them on a device. She was arrested on May the 9th and charged with suspicion of theft of a credit card with intent to use, credit card fraud of more than $100, and use of the ID of a dead person. She was held behind bars on a $4,000 bond and was immediately fired from the police department. Number 7. Penelope Williams. A British nurse lost her job due to a secret affair with a patient who died during their alone time in a hospital parking lot in Wrexham, Wales. 42-year-old Penelope Williams had worked as a registered nurse in a renal hemodialysis unit in October of 2019. She met the man, only identified as patient A, at the Wrexham Malor Hospital, where he was receiving dialysis treatment. In January of 2021, the married nurse started to have a tryst with patient A. The relationship was kept hidden until one night in January of 2022, where the pair agreed to meet at the hospital parking lot for a late-night intimate encounter. After spending less than an hour in the back of the man's car, the man allegedly started groaning and collapsed. Williams immediately called a colleague, crying while explaining what had happened. The colleague told Williams to call emergency dispatch, but she didn't. The colleague then went to check on the patient, who was unresponsive, and made the call themselves before performing CPR. When emergency personnel eventually arrived, they found patient A partially naked and lifeless. Authorities later determined that patient A died from a heart failure and chronic kidney disease triggered by a medical episode. The Betsy Cadwaladr University Health Board carried out a disciplinary hearing in May of 2022, during which Williams admitted to the relationship and to not calling an ambulance even after being advised to do so. The committee concluded the nurse's behavior breached guidance on clear sexual boundaries and struck her off from the register. Number 6. Andrew Spark. Authorities in Florida accused attorney Andrew Spark of using his position to gain access to a women's jail and filming himself while being intimate with female inmates. Detectives began investigating the 54-year-old in November of 2017, following a tip that he'd been soliciting intercourse from a female inmate at the Pinellas County Jail. Investigators determined that Spark had been intimate with 28-year-old inmate Antoinette Rose Napolitano in the attorney-client meeting room at least 6 times since her arrest 5 months prior, and that on each occasion he had put $30 to $40 in her commissary account as payment. He would record the tryst with his tablet and post the videos of their encounters on the internet. When the attorney went to visit the jail again on December the 17th, investigators were monitoring the meeting room in which he met with Napolitano and asked for oral intercourse. Detectives entered the room, found Spark with his zipper down, and took him into custody. Spark was charged with indecent exposure, introducing contraband into the county jail, and soliciting for escort services. Detectives later determined that the man had been engaged in a similar activity with another inmate named Shauna Boselli. The 25-year-old was held behind bars at the Falkenberg Road Jail in Hillsborough County. Neither of the 2 women that Spark was accused of sleeping with in jail were his actual clients. It was found out that Spark had used his Florida bar identification card in order to be allowed to meet with the inmates. Early in 2019, he was sentenced to 1 year and 5 years of probation to run concurrently after pleading guilty to the charges. Following his felony convictions, Spark was suspended. In January of 2021, he was ultimately disbarred. Number 5. McKenzie Long. 28-year-old Nevada woman McKenzie Long, who worked as an escort, was accused of stealing approximately $11,000 from a prospective client in a Las Vegas hotel. The incident unfolded at around 2 a.m. on June the 17th of 2022, when a group of hotel guests met Long and another woman on the casino floor. One man from the group exchanged numbers with the women and told them to meet up later at a hotel room. Both women went up to the room where the hotel guests had cash and passports placed in a safe. After staying in the room for a while doing whatever they were doing, the entire group moved to the hotel's pool. Shortly thereafter, they noticed that Long and the other woman had disappeared. Upon going back to their room, the group discovered that their money, passports, and laptop were missing. The victims contacted the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and reported their incident, claiming that their room was slightly ransacked and that the safe hadn't been locked. In January of 2023, Long was arrested for loitering for the purpose of exchanging intercourse for money at the Aria Resort and Casino. Furthermore, investigators determined that she'd been involved in the theft and charged her with residential burglary, possession of documents to commit forgery, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. Subsequent information indicated that the woman was released on bond while awaiting her court schedule. Number 4. Andrea Middleton. Arizona woman Andrea Middleton, who is a 7-year veteran of the Tucson Police Department, resigned on June the 13th of 2013 after she was indicted for felony computer tampering. A police internal investigation determined that Middleton, who was in her late 20s, had harassed 2 women for several days in November of 2012. According to a police report, Middleton had accessed the women's private information, such as cell phone numbers and home addresses, via law enforcement databases. She then made harassing phone calls and texts. The calls and texts had focused on the relationship at least one of the women was having with Middleton's ex-boyfriend. One of the women told police investigators that she'd been called by the woman numerous times, during which she was threatened and berated. The investigation into Middleton's conduct also determined that she'd violated numerous law enforcement policies and general orders in 3 other separate instances. Middleton pleaded guilty to 2 counts of computer tampering in August of 2013. During her sentencing on September the 13th, Pima County Superior Court Judge Howard Fell reduced the charge to a misdemeanor. Fell admonished Middleton not to attempt any contact with the victims. Ultimately, Middleton was sentenced to 3 months of probation. Number 3. Wendy Mson. Shortly after 8 a.m. on October the 2nd of 2023, Sutter County deputies were called to Nuestro Elementary School in Live Oak, California, about a teacher who was intoxicated. Upon their arrival, the suspect, Wendy Mson, was in the middle of teaching 2nd grade students. The deputies noticed signs and symptoms of Mson being under the influence. The 57-year-old was pulled out of the classroom and asked to complete a field sobriety test, which she did and failed. At around 10 a.m., she was given a breathalyzer test. It revealed that her blood alcohol level was twice over the legal limit for driving. The deputies investigated further and found footage of the teacher driving to school apparently inebriated. Mson was placed under arrest and escorted out of the campus without incident. She was charged with drunk driving, DUI with a BAC of 0.08% or higher, and child abuse with the possibility of great bodily injury. Authorities confirmed to CBS 13 that the woman did have prior arrests related to alcohol abuse, the details of which weren't disclosed. Number 2. Elizabeth Foster, Jose Gonzalez, and Labarius Williams, 3 Transportation Security Administration agents at Miami International Airport in Florida, were arrested after they were caught on camera stealing cash from travelers' luggage during security screenings. The scheme was uncovered on June the 29th of 2023 when a passenger complained that $100 was missing from her purse after she'd gone through the airport security checkpoint E. A TSA supervisor reviewed surveillance footage and learned that 3 agents had been involved, namely 20-year-old Jose Gonzalez, 22-year-old Elizabeth Foster, and 33-year-old Labarius Williams. The footage showed Foster taking the money from the purse and handing it to Gonzalez, who subsequently gave it to Williams. Other footage showed Gonzalez and Williams taking at least $600 from other travelers' wallets and purses that passed them on the way to the X-ray machine. The supervisor confronted the agents, recovered the money, and notified the police and the TSA Office of Professional Responsibility. The police launched an investigation and discovered more evidence that showed the same agents had been involved in similar thefts in the past. They also looked into more claims of theft occurring at the checkpoint. Consequently, Foster, Williams, and Gonzalez were removed from the screening duties pending the completion of the investigation and administrative actions. On July the 6th of 2023, they were arrested at the airport and booked into the Turner Guilford Night Detention Center on charges of grand theft and organizing a scheme to defraud. For unclear reasons, Miami-Dade state attorneys dropped charges against Foster in August and closed her case. The same charges against Gonzalez and Williams were dropped, but the 2 men were now accused of 3rd-degree grand theft. Both of them claimed to have stolen an average of $1,000 daily while working together, but pleaded not guilty nevertheless. Gonzalez was later accepted into a diversion program that would potentially have the charge against him dropped. He was also required to pay $700 in restitution to the victims and complete 25 hours of community service. As of the latest updates, Williams was still awaiting trial. If you enjoy this episode and are dying for more They Will Kill You content, then we are lining up our compilation on jobs and occupations that went sideways for you. Stick around if you'd like. Number 1. Viviana Ross. An English hotel waitress was fired after she was caught spending the night with Pirates of the Caribbean star Orlando Bloom, but she later said a night of incredible intercourse was worth it. The incident took place on April the 28th of 2017, when 21-year-old Viviana Ross was pouring drinks for the 40-year-old actor at the Chiltern Firehouse Restaurant and Hotel in London. When Ross's shift ended, Bloom invited her back to his suite for a drink. The man left early the next morning, but Ross remained in his bed, where a hotel manager found her. After the manager confirmed that the woman worked there, Ross was fired within the hour. She was reportedly hurt by the dismissal, but didn't regret the tryst because, according to her, Bloom was an exceptionally good lover. A year later, her opinion about losing her job apparently changed. Ross claimed that she'd lost so much, saying that employers wouldn't touch her with a barge pole. She added that she'd also lost credibility with various designers and agencies she was working with. Number 14. Kumar. In 2019, a rescue worker identified only as Kumar was part of a group of officers attempting to return a wild bear into the forest. The wild animal had been spotted in India's Velugodu Reservoir. Forest workers used ropes to tie down the bear, but it managed to break free. It immediately charged Kumar, who attempted to escape by running towards the water. The beast managed to reach the forest worker, badly mauling him. His colleagues threw rocks at the bear, and several onlookers witnessed the horrific attack from the nearby boats. The injured man was admitted into Kurnool General Hospital, where he was treated for his severe wounds. Number 13. Paul and Claudia Van Gils. Paul Van Gils and his wife Claudia had invested their life savings towards fulfilling their dream of sailing around the country in their own ship. However, their dream turned into a nightmare when their sailboat capsized near Marco Island in the Gulf of Mexico. Due to bad weather conditions, the steering cable snapped and they lost control of the vessel. The married couple managed to secure their boat on an island where they waited for help to arrive. However, when the towboat sent to rescue the stranded civilians reached the location, the anchor got ripped off, badly damaging the front of the vessel. Suddenly, the sailors were drowning, and Van Gils was forced to use his own inflatable boat in order to save his would-be rescuers. The group was later brought back to mainland by a third ship. Number 12. Pedro Viana. Professional surfer Pedro Viana was recording his training using a drone on a Portuguese beach when a 70-foot wave got the best of him. The whole situation was captured on camera as one of his friends rushed to rescue him on a jet ski. The impromptu rescuer, Lucas Chiaka, suffered an accident himself when the watercraft he was riding capsized. After losing control, the man fell dangerously close to a rock formation. A second friend, fellow surfer Ivaldo Teixeira, managed to reach the scene soon after in his own jet ski, rescuing both men. Fortunately, Viana and Chiaka didn't suffer any significant injuries. Number 11. Unnamed Rescuer. While assisting a grounded ship's crew members in Taiwan, 5 rescuers riding a helicopter suffered a horrifying crash. The chopper spun out of control and plunged into the ocean, 1,000 feet off the coast of New Taipei City. The whole accident was caught on camera. 4 people were badly injured, including the pilot, while a 5th rescuer was killed in the crash. All 21 sailors stranded in the cargo ship were eventually rescued. The reason behind the crash remains under investigation. A mission to contain the destroyed helicopter's oil spill began soon after the accident to limit any environmental damage. Number 10. 77-year-old woman. In 2019, during a flood affecting the city of Iwaki, Japan, a 77-year-old woman was left stranded in her home. The Typhoon Hagibis was a highly violent cyclone, considered to be the strongest to hit Japan in the previous 6 decades. A helicopter was deployed to rescue the unnamed woman. As she was being airlifted, however, something went horribly wrong. She was wrapped in a carrier that was connected to the helicopter by a rope. An investigation later revealed the rescuers had failed to attach the equipment properly. This error led to the victim dropping 131 feet to the ground. That's the equivalent of jumping from a 12-story building. Unfortunately, she did not survive the accident. Number 9. Linda Norgrove. Scottish aid worker Linda Norgrove was traveling to Kumar with a plan to start her own charity project. During her trip, though, Norgrove was captured by Taliban terrorists along with 3 colleagues. An operation was soon organized to rescue them. During the 13th night of their captivity, U.S. Special Forces raided the hideout, killing her captors in a shootout. When Norgrove's body was discovered, it was initially believed she'd been murdered by a suicide bomber. However, an investigation revealed that the Scottish woman had been killed by friendly fire after one of her rescuers had thrown an unauthorized grenade. Number 8. Cat rescue gone wrong. When the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, or SPCA, received a call informing them about a trapped cat, they immediately sent officers to rescue it. The cat had become stuck on a narrow ledge, 11 stories above ground. The rescuers decided to use a net in order to bring the animal back into the building. However, the feline panicked and struggled as the officer covered its body with the net. A video recording of the incident showed the cat falling just as it was about to be brought into the corridor. Though it seemed to have survived the fall at first, the SPCA confirmed it died minutes later as its wounds were too severe. Number 7. Ross and Andy Powell. Ross Powell and his adult son Andy were part of the Life Saving Club, a volunteer organization that participates in rescue missions in Australia. They received a call about a tourist struggling to remain afloat in the Sherbrooke River and rushed to the scene along with another volunteer. They rowed an inflatable boat, but a swell prompted the vessel to flip over. All 3 rescuers fell in the river, though a helicopter arrived soon to pull all 4 men out of the water. Only the tourist and the 3rd volunteer were airlifted to safety. Ross and Andy Powell had drowned before they could be rescued and were declared dead at the scene. Number 6. Karen Graham. When people at an Alabama beach noticed that swimmers were in trouble, they immediately jumped into action. They created a human chain, trying to reach the bathers caught in a rip current. Karen Graham was at the front of the chain, but the rough waters soon caught up to her as well. First responders arrived before long, and Graham was airlifted to a nearby hospital. She was unresponsive after swallowing a large amount of salt water. Though doctors attempted to revive her, it was already too late. It was later discovered she had not drowned, but rather suffered a heart attack due to a salt buildup in her system. Number 5. Unnamed Firefighters. After a portion of the sidewalk collapsed while workers were dealing with a water leak, emergency services were immediately called to the scene. A Florida worker had fallen into the hole, and firefighters attempted to rescue him. The man, named Tomasz Sikowski, died soon after the accident. While attempting to pull Sikowski out using hydraulic rescue tools, 3 firefighters sustained an electric discharge. This didn't interrupt the rescue attempt, though the 3 men were taken to the hospital immediately after Sikowski's body was pulled out. They were treated for electrical shocks and remained in stable condition. Number 4. Timothy Staples. West Valley search and rescue volunteer Timothy Staples participated in an operation to find missing Srinivas Mokapati in December of 2019. While searching for Mokapati on Mount Baldy, California, Staples got separated from his partner. His friend immediately reported him missing, fearing the worst. Hours later, he was spotted by a chopper overflying the area. He was determined that he'd slid down an ice chute. When the medic was lowered to assist the rescuer, he discovered Staples was already dead. Number 3. Unnamed Tourists. A small group of unnamed tourists were trekking in the Yosemite National Park. Their reckless behavior prompted a chain of events that led to the death of 3 people. Bystanders saw the friends jumping over a handrail before one of them slipped into the water. The unnamed man was only 20 feet away from the fall, making the situation dire. another person attempted to pull the man out but fell into the rapids. The same happened a second time, as another bystander slipped while trying to rescue the victims before it was too late. Unfortunately, the three of them dropped 300 feet as they were swept down the waterfall. Their bodies couldn't be retrieved due to the river's rapid waters. Number 2. Alaskan State Troopers. In 2013, a snowmobiler became stranded near Larson Lake in Alaska. A helicopter piloted by 2 state troopers was dispatched to rescue him. After retrieving the victim, it was meant to arrive near Talkeetna to meet medics waiting to examine him, but it failed to appear. A second rescue team was quickly put together. Bad weather conditions in the area had delayed the initial mission, making a fatal accident likely. The helicopter wreckage was discovered the following morning. No survivors were found, and it's considered that all 3 men died in the accident. The victims' names weren't released to the media up to the recording of this video. Number 1. Ktie Metro. In June of 2019, 74-year-old Ktie Metro was hiking in Arizona when she fell, injuring her face, wrist, and hips. 911 services were called, and a helicopter soon arrived to transport the elderly woman to the hospital. As she was airlifted on a stretcher, a line that prevented it from spinning failed. She began gyrating violently, over 170 times in the span of 2 minutes. As she dangled helplessly from the helicopter, her face and feet swelled up, and several blood vessels broke on her face and neck. Days after the accident, the woman remained unable to walk and reported feeling dizzy, even after resting in the hospital. Metro's husband didn't blame the first responders though, mentioning to the media how thoughtful they'd been during the rescue. Number 12. Crane collapses on house. In September of 2018, a large crane collapsed on a house in Baldwin Park, an upscale neighborhood in Orlando, Florida. The roof of the home was undergoing construction work when the truck securing the base of the crane, which had been parked in front of the house, partially turned over. The machinery's mast landed on top of the building and basically tore the roof in half. Aerial footage obtained by a local news crew showed the massive gash that the crane had left behind. Fortunately, no injuries were reported in the accident. The company operating the machinery didn't comment on what had led to the collapse. Number 11. Runaway wrecking ball. In July of 2007, a massive wrecking ball came loose from a crane cable, then rolled down a street in Meadville, Pennsylvania, wreaking havoc in its path. The wrecking ball measured about 3 feet across and weighed over 1,400 pounds, meaning it was considerably heavier than the average grizzly bear. It was being used to demolish part of a library from a local college. As the ball came loose, it raced nearly 3/4 of a mile downhill. It bounced from curb to curb, damaging more than a dozen vehicles. It ultimately came to a stop after slamming and becoming lodged into the trunk of a sedan. The impact launched the vehicle forward, causing a chain reaction with 2 other cars, which were at the traffic light. 3 people were reported as having been injured, but none to a life-threatening degree. Number 10. Cranes fall in tandem. In August of 2015, 2 cranes collapsed in a tandem attempt to lift a section of a bridge in Alphen aan den Rijn in the Netherlands. The cranes, with 400-ton and 700-ton respective capacity, were on separate barges and gearing up to lift the bridge segment from a 3rd barge. It would have been maneuvered in between the 2 cranes and then sailed to the installation site to be fitted into the existing bridge. As the multi-ton segment was being hoisted, the entire lifting assembly collapsed in a domino effect. The smaller crane's barge sloped to the point that its mast failed, and the machinery toppled over. It pulled the bridge section with it, which in turn caused the collapse of the larger crane. A number of shops and homes surrounding the construction site were destroyed, but amazingly, no one was hurt. A subsequent investigation would reveal that the lift had been doomed from the start due to a combination of overloading, insufficient stability, and the inexperience of the barge and crane operators. Number 9. Building collapse in Bangalore. In 2018, a building collapse in Bangalore, southern India, left at least 3 workers dead and several others trapped. Construction on the 5-story office building had begun 6 years prior, and after stopping halfway through, work had resumed a few months prior to the accident. While the exact cause of the collapse wasn't determined, preliminary findings suggested that it fell in line with other similar incidents. Crumbling buildings are unfortunately not uncommon in the country. They stem from high demand and lax regulations, which have led some builders to add unauthorized floors or use substandard materials. After the Bangalore office building fell over, 2 workers were found dead in the debris, while a third succumbed to his injuries in a hospital. Rescuers saved at least 7 others who'd become trapped inside the collapsed structure. Number 8. Willow Island disaster. The Willow Island disaster is often described as the deadliest construction accident in US history. In April of 1978, a cooling tower was being constructed at the Pleasance Power Station on Willow Island, West Virginia. The scaffolding was bolted to the structure it was being used to erect. As layers of concrete were being added, the scaffolding was steadily raised as well, with cranes being used to hoist the buckets of concrete. By April the 27th, the cooling tower had reached 168 feet, meaning it was about as tall as Paris's Arc de Triomphe. Shortly after 10 a.m., the cable pulling the concrete buckets slackened, and the crane collapsed towards the inside of the tower. Layers of concrete started unwrapping from the structure, causing the scaffold to plummet inside the tower's hollow center. 51 construction workers were on it at the time, and they all fell to their deaths. Many of them could only be identified by the contents of their pockets. An investigation by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, cited the contractors for 20 violations. Some of the most significant safety lapses included not giving the concrete enough time to cure before anchoring the scaffolding, using bolts of inferior quality, and only using one access ladder, which meant that escape was restricted. Number 7. Dongguan crane collapse. In April of 2016, Chinese authorities confirmed that 18 workers perished in a tragic crane collapse. It occurred at a factory construction site in Dongguan in the Guangdong province. The machinery involved in the tragic accident was a gantry crane, also known as a portal crane, which is used to straddle heavy objects. According to subsequent reports on the matter, it had been blown over in a gale. It collapsed on top of a temporary dormitory, which was used to house workers. Aside from the registered fatalities, over a dozen workers out of the 88 that had managed to escape the building suffered injuries. Officials announced that the equivalent of more than $3 million was assigned to the construction company in a special fund so that it could cope with the aftermath of the collapse. Number 6. Westgate Bridge collapse. On the 15th of October 1970, a section of the Westgate Bridge collapsed in Melbourne, Australia. To this day, it's referred to as the country's deadliest construction accident. A 367-foot span of the bridge dropped 164 feet into the Yarra River. The section weighed roughly 2,000 tons. To put the scale of the disaster into perspective, it would be like the combined weight of 20 blue whales plummeting from near the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The impact shook buildings thousands of feet away and splattered nearby houses with ejected mud. Many of the workers who perished were having lunch in huts beneath the structure. They were crushed to death in an instant. Others fell to their death from the collapsing bridge. A royal commission into the accident underlined several contributing factors. It was a combination of structural design and an unusual method of construction by the bridge's contractors. A 4.5-inch gap difference was found between 2 spans of bridge that were about to be aligned. 10 concrete ballast cubes, each weighing about 8 tons, were used to weigh down the highest span. Their weight, however, caused the section to buckle and eventually snap off. Number 5. Unnamed fallen worker. In November of 2020, an unnamed construction worker suffered a horrific fall at a construction site in Moorebank, southwest Sydney. The 49-year-old man plummeted nearly 33 feet through aluminium roofing. He was rushed to Liverpool Hospital in stable condition, but had sustained multiple fractures in both legs. Paramedics considered the worker fortunate, as the fall, which was equivalent to dropping from atop a telephone pole, could have been fatal. Number 4. V Kucherov. In January of 2020, harrowing drone footage emerged out of St. Petersburg, Russia, of a construction worker's final moments. 29-year-old V Kucherov was part of the crew contracted to assist with the demolition of a derelict ice hockey stadium. Kucherov was working atop the stadium, cutting the structures by which the roof was attached to the wall. As one of the last anchoring points was severed by the worker, the enormous roof suddenly started to collapse. Kucherov raced towards the nearby crane cradle, which at the time was holding one of his co-workers and which would have saved his life. Kucherov was only a few feet from the cable but failed to reach it in time. He went down with the building while his co-worker was hoisted to safety, narrowly escaping the massive collapsing structure. Number 3. Hawk's Nest Tunnel Disaster. The Hawk's Nest Tunnel disaster is among the worst industrial accidents in American history. In 1927, construction began on a 3-mile tunnel which carried New River under Gorley Mountain in West Virginia. A dam was immediately built below Hawk's Nest State Park to divert the flow of the river into the tunnel. During the tunnel's construction, workers found a massive deposit of the mineral silica, which they were then asked to mine. Many jumped at the opportunity of extra work, considering the widespread unemployment which was characteristic of the Great Depression. Even though the managers would wear masks and breathing equipment when visiting the site, the workers weren't given any protection. Roughly 3,000 men, most of whom were migrant African Americans, were involved in the process. Using drills and dynamite, they worked in 10 to 15-hour shifts to extract the sandstone. However, in doing so, they were exposed to silica dust and developed silicosis, which is a debilitating lung disease. It's unclear how many of them ultimately succumbed to it. A congressional hearing placed the death toll at 476, but other reports believed it to have been closer to 1,000. Number 2. Kerrie Ferris. In April of 2012, Kerrie Ferris was driving a steamroller at a site on New Zealand's South Island. At the time, 52-year-old Ferris was working on a reservoir pipeline. The 12-ton machine veered off the Maitai Valley Road and rolled down a bank. As this happened, Ferris was thrown from the operating seat and then crushed by the steamroller. Ferris became trapped and rescuers struggled for over an hour but couldn't move the machine. The father of 2 consequently sustained fatal injuries. Number 1. John Childress. On February the 26th of 2020, John Childress suffered a brutal accident at a construction site in Johnston County, Oklahoma. The 29-year-old and his crew had been hired to move silos at a Burnett Road property. It was reported that a wrecking ball accidentally came loose from a crane and swung down. Childress was struck full-on and sustained critical trauma. The emergency services were called to the scene, but in spite of first responders' resuscitation attempts, Childress was pronounced dead. Number 7. Leticia Aaso. In November of 2019, former Rochester City Court Judge Leticia Aaso was sentenced to 180 days in jail for violating the terms of her probation. Aaso's legal troubles had started with a DWI in February of 2016, which resulted in a crash on Interstate 490 near Mount Read Boulevard in the state of New York. No one was hurt, but the front of her car was damaged and both tires on the driver's side were flat. She was sentenced to a 1-year conditional discharge, the terms of which involved no alcohol consumption and an ignition interlock device installed on her car. She violated the terms of her probation that same year by attempting to drive while intoxicated and was placed in an alcohol treatment program. Her highly publicized case would see Aaso attempt to circumvent the interlock on her car on multiple occasions, and there were several reports indicating that she continued abusing alcohol. The repeated violations of her probation conditions resulted in Aaso being sentenced to 60 days in jail in 2017. She was ultimately removed from her duties due to the gravity and impact of her behavior. In late October of 2019, Aaso again appeared in court, claiming that she'd intentionally stopped going to probation meetings so that she could get in front of a judge and argue that the sentence she was serving was illegal. Ontario County Court Judge Lisa Toole told Aaso that her actions reflected she did what she wanted whenever she wanted, which Toole stated she wouldn't tolerate as she handed her the 6-month sentence. Number 6. Theresa Brennan. In January of 2020, disgraced Livingston County Judge Theresa Brennan was sentenced to 6 months in jail, an additional 18 months of probation and 200 hours of community service. Some of those in attendance clapped, with the courtroom echoing chants of "Power to the people," and one spectator reportedly shouting, welcome to your nightmare following the announcement of the sentence. A few years prior, she'd been charged with perjury, tampering with evidence, and misconduct in office, all of which are felonies. Most of the legal turbulence surrounding Brennan arose from the murder trial of Jerome Kowalski. He'd been convicted of killing his brother Richard and his wife Brenda, who'd been found dead at their Osceola Township home in May of 2008. Brennan had had an affair with Michigan State Police investigator Sean Furlong, a lead witness for the prosecution. She failed to disclose the relationship, which was ultimately deemed gross misconduct. And in light of the scandal, Kowalski's conviction was vacated, prompting a retrial. During her consequent divorce case, Brennan committed perjury by lying about a cell phone that was a marital asset and tried to delete evidence from it. She was removed from the bench by the Michigan Supreme Court in June of 2019, and her license was later suspended. Brennan entered a plea agreement in which the other charges were dropped in favor of her pleading guilty to perjury. In court, Brennan spoke about the shame and remorse she'd felt throughout the legal proceedings and concluded with a plea for mercy. Perjury carried a maximum jail term of 15 years, but as per the agreement, her sentence was far lighter. Number 5. Tracy Hunter. Former Hamilton County Juvenile Court Judge Tracy Hunter had to be dragged out of the courtroom at her 2019 sentence execution hearing as she went completely limp when her 6-month jail sentence was pronounced. The legal matter dated back to her 2014 conviction for unlawful interest in a public contract. Hunter's brother Stephen was an employee at the juvenile court. In 2013, he'd hit an offender during an arrest and was in the process of getting fired. It was alleged that Hunter had passed confidential documents to Stephen in hopes that it would help him keep his position. The former Ohio judge considered the charges unrighteous and unlawful, arguing that she hadn't helped secure employment for her brother, who'd worked for the court for 7 years before she became a judge. Protesters claimed Hunter was being discriminated against because of her race and prominence as the first ever African American elected to Hamilton County's juvenile court. In spite of numerous appeals and efforts to have her conviction overturned, the sentence was upheld and Hunter was sent to jail. Number 4. Thomas J. Maloney. Throughout the years, multiple media outlets have named Thomas J. Maloney as the worst judge in history. He was brought down as part of Operation Greylord, a joint effort by multiple agencies including the FBI, the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS, and the Internal Affairs Division of the Chicago Police Department. The operation targeted corruption in the judiciary system of Cook County, Illinois, a scandal in which Maloney became the most prominent figure. Maloney was a boxer in his youth before becoming a lawyer in the early 1950s. He established underworld connections and even secured payment to a judge for a murder acquittal. The Illinois Supreme Court named him a judge in 1977, and he quickly established a reputation as a man who could be bribed regardless of the case's gravity. The Chicago Tribune would describe him as the first and only Cook County judge to have rigged murder cases for cash. For several years, he'd managed to maintain a public image of unwavering toughness as a judge, while consistently receiving bribes and even treating defendants harshly if they didn't pay him. As Operation Greylord slowly gathered evidence against him, Maloney was indicted in 1991, much to the surprise of everyone in Cook County. Some of his most egregious rulings included the acquittal of hitman Lenny Chow and other members of the On Leong Mafia in a murder case dating back to 1981, just 4 years after he'd taken the bench. In exchange for a bribe of roughly $5,000, Maloney acquitted Owen Jones of felony murder for beating a man to death with a pipe during a burglary. He was instead sentenced to voluntary manslaughter, which cut his sentence down to 9 years instead of 20 for murder. Maloney was also on the verge of interfering in a case involving 2 members of the El Rucan street gang, accused of a double homicide, but eventually pulled out after discussing bribery terms with one of the gang's generals. In some cases, bailiff Lucius Robinson, who later testified against him, had acted as the bagman for Maloney and was later replaced by the judge's friend and fellow lawyer Robert McGee, who also cooperated with the authorities. For his crimes, Maloney served 12 years in prison from 1994 to 2007. Number 3. Mark Ciavarella and Mark Conahan. The Kids for Cash incident of 2008 is one of the most prominent and publicized scandals involving judges to have occurred in recent years. Mark Ciavarella and Mark Conahan were judges at the Luzerne County Court of Common Pleas in Pennsylvania. They were found guilty of accepting money in exchange for imposing unusually harsh adjudications on youths in order to increase the occupancy of for-profit juvenile detention centers. Conahan used his position to stop funding towards the county's public detention facility and instead sent juvenile defendants to for-profit facilities that had been newly built in exchange for kickbacks from those who owned and operated the facilities. He agreed to generate at least $1.3 million in annual receivables, which would be supported by the taxpayers. What this basically meant was that he, like Ciavarella, was illegally paid to send as many defendants to the facilities as quickly as he could without arousing suspicion. Lawyers from Philadelphia's non-profit Juvenile Law Center, whom several juveniles had sought for legal advice, found that hundreds of cases had been tried without the defendants receiving proper counsel. Ciavarella was alleged to have received $2.6 million in kickbacks from the same detention facilities. In return, he sentenced children to extended stays for minimal offenses such as trespassing in a vacant building, marking a principal on MySpace, or shoplifting DVDs from a Walmart. Thousands of youths were affected by the two judges' actions. In 2010, Conahan pleaded guilty to 1 count of racketeering conspiracy and was sentenced to 17.5 years in a federal prison. The following year, Ciavarella went to trial and was given a sentence of 28 years in a federal prison. Number 2. Samuel Kent. From 2003 to 2007, case manager Ktie Metro suffered repeated abuse at the hands of her boss, Samuel B. Kent, a Texas federal judge in the Galveston division. A former high school athlete described as a larger-than-life figure, Kent wielded immense power in the city, referring to himself as the Lion King or the Emperor of Galveston. He took advantage of his position to have his way with Metro during her employment, believing she'd be too intimidated to report him. In one incident on March the 23rd of 2007, he called her to his chambers and asked for a hug. She reluctantly accepted after telling him it was inappropriate. When the mother of 3 got close to him, the judge pulled her bra and blouse up, then started touching her inappropriately. He forced her head towards his crotch while explicitly telling her, as she struggled, what he wanted to do to her. The sound of footsteps outside the room interrupted them, and Metro left the chambers crying. While working for Kent, she'd experienced 15 to 20 incidents of harassment, at least 5 of which involved inappropriate touching. The incident in 2007 prompted her to launch a formal complaint against Kent and request immediate transfer. The following year, Kent was indicted in federal court on 3 counts of abusive contact. He thus became the first federal judge to be charged with federal crimes of such nature. Also joining the case against him was testimony from Kent's former secretary, Donna Wilkerson, whom he'd pressed against the door and forcefully kissed on the mouth on her 5th day on the job. Similar and worse inappropriate behavior towards her continued for 7 years. Another charge leveled against Kent was obstruction of justice for lying to investigators about what he'd put the 2 employees through. Under an agreement, the other charges were dropped and he was sentenced to 33 months in prison for obstruction. President Barack Obama accepted his resignation on June the 30th of 2009. Number 1. Lance Mason. Lance Timothy Mason served as a judge on the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas and from 2007 to 2008 as a member of the Ohio Senate. Mason and his wife, Aisha Nee Fraser, became separated in March of 2014. In August of that same year, he was arrested and charged for brutally beating her while he was driving, and their 2 daughters were in the back seat. According to the police report, Mason punched Fraser 20 times with his fist repeatedly smashed her head against the center console and relentlessly struck, bit, and threatened her life after she'd exited the car.
911, Shaker Police, emergency.
Yes, my husband just beat me and threw me out the car. He has my 2 daughters in the car.
Where you at?
Van Aken Boulevard.
Yeah.
And like Avalon. He just threw me out the car. Orange Saturn View 2008. I'm afraid he's going to hurt my daughters.
Is he with you now, or did he
No,
drive off?
He drove off.
Which way on Van Aken?
He went going down towards the police station. He probably hit Chagrin.
On the day of his arrest, the authorities seized a small arsenal from the judge's home. It included shotguns, handguns, and semi-automatic rifles, as well as smoke grenades, a sword, a bulletproof vest, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. On August 13th, he pleaded guilty to domestic violence and attempted felonious assault. The Ohio Supreme Court suspended him from practicing law, and in mid-September, he submitted his resignation as a judge. He was ultimately sentenced to a prison term of 2 years and was released after 9 months. On November 17th of 2018, in the driveway of a house owned by his sister, Mson once again attacked Fraser. He stabbed her repeatedly in front of their 2 children, aged 8 and 11, and left her to die. Fraser eventually succumbed to her wounds. Responding officers arrived to the address in Shaker Heights, at which point Mson tried to flee in the victim's SUV. In doing so, he slammed into a police cruiser, injuring an officer. Body cam footage would then show him running back into the house, from where he was apprehended without incident. While sitting in handcuffs in front of the house, Mson was recorded saying, "I cannot believe I did this." He pled guilty to the murder and was sentenced to life in prison, with the chance of parole after 35 years, meaning he'd be in his late 80s, if released. Number 9. Texas City Disaster. The 1947 Texas City disaster culminated in one of the most powerful non-nuclear explosions in recorded history. SS Grand Camp, a military cargo ship, caught fire while docked in the port of Texas City. Her cargo, roughly 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate, ignited. The resulting blast was catastrophic. Almost 1,000 buildings on land were razed to the ground. Nearly 7 tons of the ship's steel was blown away in a rain of incandescent shards, some of which traveled at supersonic speed. The blast was so powerful that the Grand Camp's anchor was hurled across the city. The ship's explosion was the first occurrence in a chain reaction of fires and explosions triggered in nearby oil storage facilities and other docked ships. The Texas City Volunteer Fire Department was battling the shipboard fire when the first blast occurred. All but 1 member of the 28-man department was killed. 3 out of 4 members of the Texas City Heights Volunteer Fire Department also lost their lives. All 4 Texas City fire engines were turned into mangled, burnt husks. Ultimately, roughly 200 firefighters from as far as Los Angeles joined in the effort to bring down the blaze. Fires kept burning up to a week after the initial explosions, while recovery of the bodies took nearly a month. With at least 581 casualties, the Texas City disaster is considered the worst industrial accident in American history. The scene left behind by the explosion was compared to the aftermath of the Nagasaki atom bombing. Number 8. Siberian Smoke Jumpers. In 2012, a wildfire broke out in a forested area of the Republic of Tuva in southern Siberia. Because of the remote location, a team of 14 firefighting paratroopers, commonly known as smoke jumpers, was dispatched from a forest security airbase. They were equipped with backpack fire extinguishers and small power pumps. After they reached the ground, their mission was to control the blaze, which was expanding rapidly because of strong winds. Unfortunately, only 6 of the paratroopers survived. The others became trapped, surrounded by inescapable walls of fire. In the tragedy's aftermath, flags were flown at half-mast all over Tuva. A Siberian emergency center reported that the blaze was a consequence of irresponsible fire handling practices by the region's inhabitants. Number 7. 2015 Tianjin Explosions. In August of 2015, a series of explosions ravaged a container storage station at the port of Tianjin, the largest port in northern China. The most intense of the explosions involved the detonation of about 800 tons of ammonium nitrate, which is a rough equivalent to 256 tons of TNT. The resulting fireballs rose hundreds of feet into the air. The event was powerful enough to be registered by earthquake measuring equipment, as well as by a Japanese meteorological satellite. Fires caused by the initial blasts burned from the 12th of August into the 15th, when 8 more explosions occurred. Over 1,000 firefighters were dispatched to the site, and some were caught by the high-intensity blasts. Others perished while tirelessly combating the blaze. Out of the 173 registered fatalities of the Tianjin explosions, 104 were firemen. 11 police officers also perished in what's been described as the worst incident for the country's frontline responders since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. An investigation concluded in 2016 that the explosion which triggered the devastating incident had been caused by an overheated dry cellulose container. Number 6. Bombay Dock Explosion. On April the 14th of 1944, the SS Fort Steichen freighter exploded at Victoria Dock in Bombay, present-day Mumbai. It was carrying a mixed load which included roughly 1,400 tons of explosives, such as torpedoes, mines, and shells. A fire broke out on the ship, and dockside fire teams, assisted by fireboats, pumped about 900 tons of water into the vessel. Due to the intensity of the blaze, the water started to boil on the ship. Unfortunately, the fire couldn't be contained, and 2 earth-trembling explosions followed. The first broke the ship in 2 and shattered windows up to 7.5 miles away. The second sent showers of burning debris into the slums nearby. Nearly a dozen ships at dock were destroyed, while some of the city's most economically significant areas were wiped out. 800 to 1,350 citizens were killed. Firefighters from the Bombay Brigade bravely battled the raging blaze for 3 days before it was finally brought under control. 71 firefighters lost their lives while relentlessly working to save the citizens of Bombay, of whom an estimated 50,000 were abruptly left homeless. The headquarters of the Mumbai Fire Brigade has a memorial honoring the firemen who died. Number 5. Great Fire of 1910. In 1910, on the weekend of August the 20th to 21st, one of the most catastrophic wildfires in the history of the United States broke out in North Idaho and western Montana, which extended to parts of Washington and British Columbia. The winter and spring of that year had been extremely dry, and the summer unprecedentedly hot. Up to 3,000 independent fires emerging from various sources were burning by mid-August. Then on the 20th, hurricane-level winds grouped them into 1 or 2 enormous blazing infernos. Firefighters from the U.S. Forest Service heroically combated the monstrous firestorm, which was virtually impossible to control with the resources the service had at the time. 3 million acres eventually burned down, an area 1.5 times larger than the island of Hawaii. Smoke clouded the sky hundreds of miles out into the Pacific Ocean. At least 78 firefighters perished in the initial disaster, while others would later succumb to the smoke damage sustained by their lungs. Outside of Avery, Idaho, an entire 28-strong team was tragically overcome by massive walls of flames. The Great Fire of 1910 would eventually highlight firemen as national heroes and raise public awareness towards nature conservation. Number 4. Kingman Explosion. On July the 5th of 1973, a powerful explosion occurred in Kingman, Arizona, which led to the death of multiple firefighters. A railroad tank car was transporting propane when a hairline crack in its structure caused a leak. Static electricity then generated a spark, which ignited the leaking gas, which was odorless. The railroad car basically became a giant blowtorch. The liquid propane inside started to heat up rapidly, thus increasing pressure inside the tank. The Kingman Fire Department arrived on site and prepared a deluge gun, a high-capacity water jet, with the intention of cooling the car. Tragically, they'd never get the chance to use it. The tank reached its bursting limit and the car exploded. In an instant, thousands of gallons of boiling liquid propane turned to gas due to the sudden pressure drop and simultaneously ignited. A fireball roughly 1,000 feet in diameter rose to the sky, and the explosion's shockwave was heard and felt across a 5-mile radius. 3 firefighters perished instantly, while 8 others succumbed to their burns shortly thereafter. A state trooper and a railroad worker were also killed in the explosion, while up to 90 onlookers who gathered on the highway were burned or injured. Number 3. Chicago Union Stockyards Fire. In December of 1910, a fire broke out at a warehouse of the Chicago Union Stockyards. First reported in the early hours of December the 22nd, the fire was rapidly listed as a 4-alarm blaze, meaning that multiple units were required to control it. By the morning of December the 23rd, when the fire was put out, 7 hook and ladder companies along with 50 fire engine companies had been called to the scene. The most tragic incident involving the massive firefighting effort was when a flaming building collapsed, killing 3 civilians and 21 firefighters, including Chief James J. Horan, who were all inside it at the time. In 2010, a memorial was raised near the location of the fire to commemorate the heroic firefighters who perished in the disaster. Number 2. Man Gulch Fire. Smoke jumpers are the tip of the spear when it comes to remote wildfires, as they provide a vital initial attack. It's a dangerous trade that combines parachuting with firefighting in rough terrain and sometimes against overwhelming odds. On August the 5th of 1949, a team of smoke jumpers parachuted to a valley in Montana's Helena National Forest, where a wildfire had been reported. The 15-strong first response team met up with a former smoke jumper who worked as a fire guard at a campground in the Man Gulch area. With each of them carrying almost 100 pounds of equipment, the brave firefighters closed in on the raging blaze. As they did so, sudden high winds caused the fire to expand rapidly. The smoke jumpers were forced into an uphill retreat. A blow-up of the fire then covered 3,000 acres within minutes. 12 smoke jumpers and an additional firefighter were caught in the flames. It would become the fire with the greatest toll of smoke jumper deaths. The youngest member of the crew, 17-year-old Robert W. Sally, was among the 3 survivors. After it had spread to 4,500 acres, 550 men worked for 5 more days before the Man Gulch fire was finally brought under control. Number 1. Great Kanto Earthquake Firestorms. Aside from tsunamis and landslides, the horrors involved with the Great Kanto earthquake were also marked by enormous fires. On September the 1st of 1923, the Kanto Plain on the main Japanese island of Honshu was struck by a 7.9 earthquake. It occurred during lunchtime while people were cooking meals over fires. Uncontrollable blazes broke out immediately after the earthquake, and at the same time, a strong typhoon brought high winds to the Tokyo Bay. The currents connected the localized blazes into devastating firestorms. In downtown Tokyo, a depot was struck by a catastrophic fire tornado. About 38,000 people who'd taken shelter there were incinerated within minutes by the flaming vortex. Firemen were dispatched all over the city, and a number of them fell victims to the inferno that had gripped Tokyo. The earthquake had broken water mains all over the city, which complicated their fight against the blaze. It took 2 days of continuous work in hazardous conditions before the fires were put out. There isn't a reliable figure for the total number of firefighters claimed by the disaster, which yielded by most estimates up to 140,000 fatalities. Number 11. Tim Filfer. In November of 2015, demolition worker Tim Filfer walked away virtually unscathed after a century-old smokestack collapsed on top of him. Filfer and his crew had been tasked with demolishing the towering chimney at the former Avondale Mills smokehouse in Alabama. They'd attempted to bring it down using explosives, but when that didn't work, Filfer decided to take a manual approach. He got into an excavator and spent over an hour tearing into the tower. The massive structure eventually started to buckle. The crowd that had gathered watched in horror as the chimney, instead of falling into the open space, collapsed on top of Filfer's excavator. In the incident's aftermath, the worker's daughter ran towards the rubble, fearing the worst. Amazingly, Filfer climbed out of the machinery by his own power and had only sustained a few scratches. Number 10. Steve Ballas. In December of 2016, an Australian man arrived at his residence in West Sydney to find that his house was more than halfway through being torn down. To avoid a confrontation with the workers, Steve Ballas opted to call the police. The demolition crew told the authorities they'd been hired to bulldoze the house, an operation for which Ballas had supposedly given permission. Yet the man had never done so and was shocked upon seeing that all which remained from the house was a single wall. The confusion had stemmed from the fact that the street numbers didn't reflect what had been written on the title. For years, Ballas thought that he was living at number 200 Marion Street, as indicated by the letterbox, but his home was actually on 198. It was his next-door neighbor, the real number 200, who'd actually contracted the demolition company. The confusion was further exacerbated by the lack of furniture inside Ballas's home. However, that was because the man had planned to rent it out and not tear it down. Compensation was offered and an investigation was launched, but the matter was initially deemed to have been an honest mistake. Number 9. Didcot Power Station Collapse. On February the 23rd of 2016, a disastrous collapse of a 10-story boiler house caused the death of 4 workers at a natural gas power plant in Oxfordshire, England. The massive steel-framed building was being prepped for explosive demolition. A crew had been tasked with cutting key points inside and outside in order to weaken the structure. In the months leading up to the catastrophic collapse, some of the workers expressed concerns about the instability of the site. They argued that the former boiler house was simply too heavy and that it wouldn't be safe to send men inside after weakening it. Then, as feared, a large section of the steel frame collapsed. Demolition worker Mick Collins was killed outright, while 3 others were declared missing and presumed dead. Search efforts were hampered by the debris pile, which was around 30 feet high, as well as by the instability of the remaining structure. Since it had become too dangerous to send anyone inside, robots were used to plant explosive charges. What was left of the boiler house was demolished in a controlled explosion in July of 2016. The bodies of the 3 missing workers were found in the months following the demolition, in spite of their families' initial protest of wanting them back in one piece, not hundreds of pieces. Number 8. James K. In June of 2011, a fire ravaged parts of a plant in Kirkby, England. The factory, operated by engineered wood products manufacturer Sonnet Industria, had earned a reputation of being cursed amongst the locals. Just a few months prior to the fire, 2 workers had died in a gruesome accident after getting tangled in a conveyor belt. Then in August of 2011, a demolition team was contracted to tear down parts of the building that the blaze had damaged. One member of the crew, 62-year-old James K, was operating a cherry picker crane. At some point, K accidentally pushed the crane into a metal beam. It's believed that he'd leaned over the controls after being dazzled by sunlight. K's neck was crushed between the beam, which was behind him, and the control panel of the machinery, which he was facing. He died at the scene as a result of traumatic asphyxia. Number 7. Worker survives collapse. In October of 2013, a worker in downtown Dayton, Ohio, narrowly escaped being crushed to death by the building he'd been helping demolish. The man, whose name wasn't released, was part of a crew tasked with tearing down the former Dayton Daily News newspaper building. He was inside an excavator, gradually ripping off parts of the 6-story building. The structure then suddenly collapsed on top of the machinery, while the worker was still inside. Amazingly, the man survived in spite of the excavator having been struck by multiple tons of debris. According to one of his fellow workers, he escaped with his life by following the protocol which, in such a scenario, dictated he remain inside his cage. Once the dust cleared, he simply walked away from the excavator. Number 6. Demolition in Denmark. In April of 2018, a demolition operation in Vordingborg, Denmark, ended with a giant silo collapsing in the wrong direction. The obsolete concrete silo stood at roughly 173 feet, meaning it was nearly as tall as Disney World's Cinderella Castle. A demolition plan had been put together for roughly 6 months, and several onlookers had gathered at the city's harbor to watch what was meant to be a controlled explosion. It's still unclear why the operation went wrong. A large hole had been cut into the side of the concrete silo to ensure that it would fall away from the buildings nearby. The charges were detonated, and initially, the giant structure seemed to be falling according to plan. Yet as more of it crumbled, the silo switched direction. It landed on a library, partially destroying it. The blasting manager took full responsibility for the failed demolition, in which fortunately no one was hurt. In November of 2014, an unnamed worker at a State Island demolition site in New York City died following a brutal accident. The building being torn down was a former car dealership, which had been replaced by a new one built next door. At around 8:15 a.m., a portion of the building's concrete roof unexpectedly crumbled. The demolition worker was buried under an amalgam of debris. He sustained critical crushing injuries and was later pronounced dead at Richmond University Medical Center. 3 other workers were reportedly inside the building as the roof had come crashing down, but they survived. Number 3. Shannon Brashear. In August of 2020, a demolition worker in the UK was left battling for her life after accidentally being struck by a crane. 20-year-old Shannon Brashear worked for Ace Demolition at a site on South Church Boulevard, London. The young woman, described as the sole provider for her family, was hit on the head by the heavy machinery. While the details of the accident weren't released, it was reported that a 55-year-old worker was being investigated on suspicion of grievous bodily harm. Brashear was taken to the emergency room and then placed on life support at Royal London Hospital. She'd suffered a severe brain injury as well as a broken back and multiple facial fractures. A fundraiser was started in her name, and according to the latest update offered by Brashear's family, the young woman emerged from her coma and started physical therapy. She also underwent major facial surgery to mend the severe damage to her lip, septum, eye, and jaws. Number 2. Man struck by debris. In the summer of 2013, onlookers had gathered behind a 1,000-foot perimeter to watch an old power plant as it was about to be demolished in Bakersfield, California. The explosive charges had been arranged in a predetermined pattern to ensure that the implosion wouldn't affect the surrounding area. Yet moments after the structure was brought down, a police officer patrolling the event heard screaming nearby. A piece of metal debris ejected by the blast had struck an unnamed 43-year-old man, causing brutal injuries. A part of his leg was severed, and the man was airlifted to a hospital in Fresno, where doctors had to amputate his limb to manage the damage. At least 2 other onlookers had suffered minor lacerations from the flying debris, while several parked cars on the street were struck as well. Number 1. Eugene Titov. In 2013, a passerby was killed after stopping to film the demolition of an old home in western Russia's Lipetsk Oblast. 29-year-old Eugene Titov, who was working nearby, started recording but accidentally got too close to the demolition site. A digger was pulling down a wall by using chains that had been connected to the structure. A large section from the top of the wall broke apart as it came down with a loud thud and sent a cloud of debris flying towards Titov. The man was brought down by the force of the impact and would later be pronounced dead in a local hospital. Number 5. Jesse J. Warren. In the late 2000s, Jesse J. Warren worked as a mechanic at a Penske truck rental and leasing business near the city of Kennesaw, Georgia. He had developed a reputation among his co-workers of being unsociable and unable to focus on the job. Warren was ultimately let go. On January the 12th of 2010, in the afternoon, Warren returned to the Penske office clad in camouflage and armed with a handgun. He shot 4 co-workers and a customer. Only one of the victims survived. Warren then fled the scene in a Chevrolet S10 truck but was arrested less than a mile from the scene of the crime. Warren was deemed incapable to stand trial and in 2017 was indefinitely committed to a mental institution. Number 4. Verlin Spencer. In the late 1930s, Verlin Spencer was the principal of the South Pasadena Junior High School. By 1939, Spencer's critical and perfectionist style had caused friction with the school's staff. Superintendent George C. Bush eventually placed the principal on an involuntary leave of absence. Spencer's abrasive behavior worsened upon his return to the school, and he was eventually fired on April the 30th of 1940. The man didn't accept his termination and demanded a hearing, which was set for May the 6th. On that date, Spencer arrived at the administrative office where the meeting was held, armed with his .22 caliber Colt Woodsman handgun and 50 rounds of ammunition. He fatally shot Superintendent Bush, as well as the principal of the South Pasadena High School and the school district's business manager. He then drove a few blocks to the junior high school and gunned down 2 teachers who he thought had plotted against him. As Spencer was cornered in the cafeteria, he tried to take his own life by shooting himself in the abdomen. He survived his injuries and subsequently pled guilty to all charges. Spencer was paroled in 1977 at the age of 75 and lived out the rest of his days helping to rehabilitate former convicts in Hawaii. Number 3. Jinghua Wu. On November the 14th of 2008, one of the deadliest workplace killings in Silicon Valley history took place at the office of a startup company called Cyport. After he'd been fired from the company, a man named Jinghua Wu returned to the office later that day armed with a 9mm caliber handgun. The 47-year-old then executed 3 of his former bosses by shooting them in the head at point-blank range. The victims were the Vice President of Operations, Brian Pugh, Human Resources Manager, Marilyn Lewis, and the company's CEO, Sid Agrawal. Wu was arrested shortly after the multiple shooting. During his trial, he tried pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. As part of his defense, he claimed that he'd been wrongfully terminated and that he had no recollection of the killing spree. Wu was eventually found guilty on all charges and in August of 2013 was sentenced to life in prison plus 75 years, without the possibility of parole. Number 2. Gary Martin. On February the 15th of 2019, Gary Martin opened fire on his former co-workers at the Henry Pratt Company in Aurora, Illinois. It's unclear whether Martin had been dismissed from his job a few weeks prior or if his termination had occurred on the day of the shooting. He was armed with a handgun that had a green laser sight attached to it. He shot and killed 5 male workers, including the plant manager, an HR manager, and a 21-year-old student on his first day as a human resources intern. Martin then engaged responding police officers in a 90-minute shootout, which led to 5 officers and a civilian being injured. The attacker was ultimately shot and killed by law enforcement. Martin had a criminal record going back to the mid-1990s and had spent jail time in Mississippi for felony aggravated assault. He'd previously made threats while working at the manufacturing plant, claiming he'd kill everyone inside if he ever got fired. Number 1. David Burke. On December the 7th of 1989, a disgruntled former employee of US Air hijacked a Pacific Southwest Airlines flight, causing the death of 42 passengers. 35-year-old David Augustus Burke had been dismissed from his job as a ticketing agent for petty theft. Burke had tried to get reinstated, but the meeting with his manager, Ray Thompson, was unsuccessful. Burke then boarded Flight 1771 from Los Angeles to San Francisco, a flight that Thompson was also on as part of his daily commute. Burke hadn't surrendered his employee credentials, which is how he was able to sneak a .44 Magnum revolver aboard the plane. Most of what followed was deduced from the cockpit voice recorder. It's believed that after the plane had reached cruising altitude, Burke shot Thompson dead. A flight attendant then opened the cockpit door, informing the pilots that there was a problem. The gunman executed her, announcing, "I am the problem." 2 more shots were heard, likely indicating that Burke had either incapacitated or killed both pilots. The aircraft then pitched down and accelerated. It crashed into the side of a rocky hill in the Santa Lucia Mountains. It disintegrated after impacting at about 770 miles per hour, which is slightly faster than the speed of sound.
Thanks for watching. Would you rather get in a physical relationship with an ugly supervisor in exchange for a promotion, or get romantically involved with a hot colleague? Let us know in the comments section below.